fabulous humans, and welcome to another rendition of the About That podcast with me, your host, your favorite geek psychologist, your favorite pop culture enthusiast, your favorite queen of the nerds, Dr. Vanessa Hintz. And I am ecstatic, elated, overjoyed, positively tickled for today's episode because I get to bring to you all content focused on one of my most favorite things in the history of forever, the television show Supernatural. So welcome to more supernatural-centric content that I'm actually going to refer to as a supernatural spotlight. You see what I did there with that alliteration? The supernatural spotlight. And the way that this came to me is that, okay, so I have watched the series Supernatural through one time, and I'm now going back and doing my first rewatch. And I thought that I would take a pause for the cause in between each season and just really reflect on what it is that I saw, particularly given that I know what's coming through this series. But I absolutely wanted to really, now that I know what's happening, now that I have been through this journey once before, and going back through it again, I want to really be mindful of some messages that I receive, some lessons that are learned, particularly given my expertise in psychology, in equity and inclusion, all of those different things. I definitely am, now that, again, I'm sort of more familiar with the story, the characters, all those different things. Using that lens as I rewatch it, also, it's just very comforting for me to watch the show again. This goes without saying, but spoiler alert, if you have not watched Supernatural Season 1 or Supernatural ever, I'm going to say stuff that may be spoiling to you. So just, first of all, do yourself a favor and watch it. I just want everybody coming into this with all of the information, with all the facts. So, spoilers abound. But again, I just finished my rewatch of season 1, and I think that I have mentioned this before, but I actually am a newbie to Supernatural. I didn't watch any of Supernatural until last summer, the summer of 2022, when I started watching, finished the series in about 6 months. Right before I went to my first Supernatural fan convention, which was awesome. Please listen to episode 2 if you're curious about that experience. So again, now I'm in my sort of first rewatch, and I have rarely in my life rewatched series. I kind of feel like I know what's going to happen. Why would I do that again? Exceptions being Game of Thrones, which I have rewatched several times, except I don't rewatch season 8 past episode 3 because, that's how I feel about that. I've definitely watched Law & Order SVU a gajillion times, even though I'm not caught up on the most current episodes. The Boys, I have watched. The X-Files. That might be about it. Stranger Things, maybe not. I don't know, but I don't typically rewatch things. I will rewatch movies a gajillion times. But shows, I don't know. There's just something I feel like there's always something new to watch. So it is somewhat rare for me to rewatch a show, but Supernatural has absolutely become a comfort to me. And I'm going to talk to you all about season 1, and it obviously pulled me in initially when I watched it. And so just to give you all some context, so Supernatural premiered on September 13th, 2005. You heard that. September 13th, 2005. And so I think we just need to go into this conversation with that context, right? Like, the early 2000s was a very different time. It was a wild time. Even watching the show sort of like aesthetically, you're sort of transported back, for those of us who were there, transported back to the early 2000s. I mean, people have flip phones, which I actually miss because you cannot aggressively hang up on someone with a smartphone. You just can't. But I mean, flip phones, paper maps, people up here printing out MapQuest directions. Like, it was wild. Watching them use the internet in the early 2000s, wild. And I will talk about this, I'm sure, again and again. But I forgot what fashion was like in the early 2000s. I don't know how I forgot this, but why was everything so big? Why were everyone's clothes so big? And then like for women, then there were like small like half jackets that really just don't keep you like warm, but they were fashionable. Like so they were like big clothes, but then there were like too little clothes, and wearing long sleeve shirts under short sleeve shirts under long, like it was just too much. And so I think that for me there is also some nostalgia, for lack of a better word, in watching these early seasons of Supernatural, because 2005, that was a time. That was a time. The early 2000s, that was a time. And so just an overview. Season 1 of Supernatural, we're obviously introduced to the brothers Winchester, Sam and Dean, for the very first time, and their dad, John Winchester, played by the amazing Jeffrey Dean Morgan. And let me just say, Jeffrey Dean Morgan, Jensen Ackles, Jared Padalecki, all these men are aging in reverse, okay? Like fine wine. When I watched the pilot episode of Supernatural and I saw Jeffrey Dean Morgan, I said, I know that's not Negan, because he definitely looks 20 years older than Negan. And it took me a while to accept the fact that that was Negan, but let me just say, aging like fine wine, aging in reverse, I'm here for it, point blank period, I approve. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, we meet the brothers Winchester. And the sort of overarching story of season 1 is that they're looking for their dad, who went on a hunting trip and then was nowhere to be found. And so Sam is actually at Stanford. He's a, smarty arty, about to go to law school at Stanford. Dean kind of shows up and he's like, hey, our dad is missing. I need you to come help me find him. And he's like, all right. Tragedy ensues where, Sam decides, I don't want to do this with you, Dean. Like, I want to go back to law school. He goes back to school. His girlfriend is killed. And now he's like, all right, cool. So I'm going to just hunt with you because this is a mess and I don't want to deal with this anymore. And so over the course of season 1, we sort of have a combination of different types of episodes, which we see throughout the series. So we have these like Monster of the Week episodes where we are with Sam and Dean as they're hunting some supernatural thing or another. And then we have episodes that sort of are more in this overarching story of them trying to find their dad so that they can figure out what's going on. Very akin to the X-Files, very akin to a lot of series really, but I remember when I first started watching Supernatural, I felt like this is very much like the X-Files, where you saw those Monster Week episodes, Alien a Week episodes, whatever you want to call it. And then you had this sort of overarching story. But with the X-Files, I feel like I never knew what was going on. I still to this day don't understand what was true and what was not. I guess that was the point. Anyways, back to Supernatural. So that's sort of like the overview of season 1. Spoiler alert, they find their dad. And they figure out that their dad is hunting this demon that killed their mom and also killed Sam's girlfriend. So then they all join together to find this demon. They do find it, but unfortunately they do not kill it. And so we're actually left with a cliffhanger at the end of season 1 where they get hit. They get into a car accident and they're hit by this truck and they're kind of just laying there. We don't know what's going to happen. We do know what's going to happen because we know that there are 15 seasons, but at the moment, in the moment, we don't really know what's going to happen with them. We don't really understand their fate. So that's season 1 in a nutshell. And so what I thought would be beneficial and sort of, like I said in my rewatch, is to really think about what messages I feel like, or what lessons I feel like I received from this that I can then in turn share with you all, again, as a psychologist, as a mental health expert, what have you. And so before I get there, though, one thing that I will say is overall, like sort of looking at the season overall, one thing that I can appreciate now on my rewatch is that so many of our favorite zingers, like our favorite lines from the entirety of the series, come from season 1. Driver picks the music, shotgun shuts his cake hole. Season 1. I think it was like in the first episode. Dude, you fugly. What kind of house doesn't have salt? Low sodium freaks? Like all of these things that, again, are sort of like iconic in the Supernatural fandom. I did not realize how many of them came from this initial season. The other thing that I will say about the first season is I remember when I watched it the first time, I remember texting my older sister. I was like, yo, this is like lightweight scary. And I love horror movies. Like, I love scary movies. It's my thing. I was like, some of this is like actually quite scary for this to be like a TV show. Not like American Horror Story level. No, maybe some of it was, because that's a different conversation. But it was kind of scary, right? And I will also say that I appreciated all of the urban legends that they incorporated, because for me as a horror fan, that's sort of how I got into horror. I remember reading, I know you all remember Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark in elementary school. Like, why was I reading that in elementary school? But I remember all three of those books were in our elementary school library. And so those types of stories, urban legends, things like that, things that seem to take on lives of their own, I can appreciate that. And I loved how Supernatural incorporated these. Like, I think there was a Bloody Mary episode, there was a Hookman episode, like all of these different things that we are familiar with. And I remember watching, I think it was episode 2 or episode 3, when they were, I think it was episode 2, when they were hunting the Wendigo. I remember knowing what that was because of the X-Files. Like, I remember watching it and I was like, oh, they're hunting a Wendigo. And like, before they even said it, and I'm like, okay, nerd alert, first of all. But second of all, I think, again, that sort of familiarity that urban legends bring, and that type of, like, I think it was just super dope. And I actually feel like as the series goes on, they get like further away from that, because again, there's sort of more lore, there's more sort of like series storyline that they're working through. And so I really feel like this first season, we got a lot of that, again, urban legend, sort of like, I don't want to call it classic horror, but I will. And I love everything about it. And so overall, those are sort of my season notes. We get so many of the zingers that we love. And there was really like this classical horror, like around the campfire, scary story type of element. And I love that. Slashers are my favorite type of horror film, and this gave me a lot of those vibes, and I'm here for it. Now to transition to what I feel like were what I'll call some mental health messages from season 1, things that, again, from my lens, my worldview, I feel like were evident in what we saw in season 1. And the first thing I want to talk about is the way that they dealt with trauma. So the first episode of the series, the pilot episode, we see Mary Winchester basically burned and killed, and her family witnesses this. So we have Jeffrey Dean, we have a little small Dean, I think he was like 5 or 6, and then we have Sam, he's like a baby, so, you know, negligible, he's not gonna remember this, but we have this family that experiences this trauma, this tragedy, and then we have a whole fast forward in the pilot episode where we don't know nothing about nothing that happened after that. And then over the course of the series, we get to really see how each of those men dealt with that trauma. And so for me, it was so interesting, because you see Jeffrey Dean. Also, let me just caveat this. I have not yet watched the Winchesters, so I don't know how they deal with any of this that I'm about to say in the Winchester. So don't come for me, people. I haven't watched it yet. Maybe my appraisal will change after I watch it. So this is me without knowledge of anything that's in the Winchesters. Okay. So over the course of season 1, we see sort of, again, John Winchester has just like his whole life's purpose is to find this thing that killed his wife. And I think it's near the end of the first season where he has this very emotional moment, and he talks about how he felt like he couldn't rest until that demon was dead, because he didn't feel like Sam or Dean or him would ever be safe again unless he killed this demon. So that literally became his life's focus, at the expense of other things like parenting, which we'll talk about in a few moments. So that's sort of how John Winchester dealt with that. And Dean sort of, we almost see him like, I don't really like this phrasing, overly identifying with his dad. Like, he basically wants, he idolizes him. He wants to be just like him. He sort of listens to everything that he says. His life is about living up to his dad's expectations. And so he kind of gets really close to his dad, whereas we see Sam sort of doing the opposite. And I think it goes without saying, Sam was the youngest one when his mom was killed, and so he doesn't really have a recollection of her as a person. And he says that in one of the scenes in the first season where he's talking to Dean, he's like, I see pictures of her, but I don't have any memory of her. And so the way that he sort of responds to her death is very different than his dad or his brother, because again, she was like not, I mean, she was a person to him, and I guess he feels like he loves her out of principle, but he didn't know her. And so we see Sam going like the whole opposite direction of his dad and his brother. Like, nah, I'm going to go to college. I'm going to live this life over here. I want to be normal. I don't want to be doing all this hunting all the time. And again, that is a sticking point throughout the entirety of the first season and the series as well. And so the way that they deal with that each of them sort of over time really copes with this trauma, I think is very, very interesting. And again, I think we see that initially from the very beginning of the series in season 1. And I mentioned John's parenting styles, and so I want to pause and just take a moment to put on my professor, Dr. Vanessa hat, and just slide some knowledge to anybody who is unaware. But typically when we talk about parenting styles, first of all, there's no right or wrong way to parent. You parent the way that works best for you and your family and your kids and their individual ways of being. So let me just say that initially, I'm not here to tell anybody how to do anything, how to parent your kids, what have you. What I will say is that oftentimes we categorize parenting styles 4 different ways. There can be more, but I'm going to use these primary 4. We have permissive parenting, neglectful parenting, authoritative parenting, and authoritarian parenting. And we can think of those each on a spectrum of sort of warmth and setting boundaries or setting limits. And so permissive parents tend to be very warm, very loving, but don't set a lot of boundaries. So they just let their kids like live their best lives, do what you want. You're a free spirit. We don't really have any rules. Cool. Very warm, very loving. Neglectful parents are low on both of those categories. So not very loving, not very warm, don't really set limits or boundaries, typically seem like they don't really care about what their kids are doing. And this is a conversation for a different day, but having a neglectful parent early on in your life, that can cause a whole host of issues as people sort of mature and start to develop their own relationships. Authoritative parents are high on the warmth category and tend to be high on the boundary category as well. Some people will say that this is the quote unquote ideal way to parent. Again, I will not say that. I will say that in research that this tends to be the gold star way of parenting, because again, you're providing your kids what they need emotionally. You're also setting appropriate limits for them so that, they're not out here being like entitled and all these different things. So that's authoritative parenting. And then lastly, we have authoritarian. And this is where I think we see John Winchester after sort of his wife's death. The way that he parents his kids would be, again, in what I would consider an authoritarian style, which is very low on the love and warmth scale and very high on the limits and boundary scale. So almost like drill sergeant-like. And I think we see that even, when Sam and Dean talk to him is yes or no, sir, which again is not good, bad, or whatever, but it is very much like it's very clear what our boundaries are. It's very clear sort of what the scale is, what the hierarchy is within our family. And we also see throughout this first season and sort of get hints to, why Sam and his dad fell out, which was essentially because Sam was like not trying to be about that life. Like Sam reminded me very much of myself. You always want to know why you're doing what you're doing. Like, why are we doing this? What is happening? Why are we doing this? I'm not going to just do something because you said so. Whereas Dean is quote unquote the good little soldier. I would argue that John's authoritarian parenting style is absolutely correlated with the experience of losing his wife and the way that he lost his wife. So I would argue, and this is me just speculating, I would argue that John wasn't that type of parent before Mary died. Mary died the way that she died. John started to develop these feelings of, I have to protect my family at all costs. We're not going to be safe until this demon is killed. He governs in this sort of authoritarian way so that he can keep his kids safe. And so even though this may not be quote unquote an ideal way to parent, from his perspective, it absolutely is, because that is what's going to keep his kids safe. And so again, one message that I feel like that I took from season 1, how each of these primary characters responded to the loss of Mary Winchester and what impact that had not only on their development over time as men, but also the relationships between the two. So the second thing I want to talk about is something that was surprising to me, surprising in a good way. And that is specifically related to episode 13 of season 1, titled Route 666. And so just to give an overview of the episode, Sam and Dean are called to this rural town in Ohio, and Dean is actually contacted by an old girlfriend of his named Cassie Robinson, whose father was just murdered. And she believes that the murder is something supernatural related. And in the context of the episode, we learned that Dean and Cassie had somewhat of an intense relationship that ended after Dean told Cassie what it is that he does for a living and what his family business is. She assumed that he was lying or he was crazy or all of the above. And so she broke up with him, and Dean, with his whole emotional stuff he got going on, that rejection was a lot for him. Okay, whatever. So we find out that they break up because Dean was honest with her and she did not think that he was being honest. And so sad. And so what is happening in this town is that there are a string of sort of unexplainable murders, with all of the victims being Black men. And so in one of the initial scenes at a crime scene, we see Cassie sort of raising this with the sort of town officials, like, all of these victims are Black. Like, what are you doing about that? Like, is anybody noticing that there's a pattern? What have you? And so in the course of this investigation, we see that there's this sort of ghost truck that is killing all of these people. And this truck is actually being haunted by a white man who lived in the town many moons ago. Now we learn more about this guy. His name is escaping me, but this guy essentially was killed after he attacked Cassie's father back in the day. So this guy who is haunting this truck was not down with the fact that Cassie's white mother was dating her Black father. And so he attacked them one day. And in the course of this fight, Cassie's father fights back and kills this man. And after he kills this man, he calls his friends, other Black men, and they all decide, like, you know, if we tell the police, like, we're going to jail, we're going to be blamed. They're not going to believe that it was self-defense, because this is like 1960s rural Ohio and it's racist up in here. And so they decide to just put this man in his truck and put him in the bottom of a lake. And I should also add that this guy, what we learn in the context of the episode is that he had bombed a church in a Black neighborhood, like, before this fight ensued. That actually killed a lot of Black people. And so, needless to say, this man who seems to have a lot of racist ideals is haunting this truck and going after all of the people that he feels like are responsible for his death. So, in true Winchester fashion, Sam and Dean figure it out. They do what they need to do and get this guy out of here. But nonetheless, what I feel like was very powerful about this, a couple of things. And so one, just Cassie as a character, I very much appreciated and valued. Cassie is a woman who identifies as biracial and who we see in the episode has a white mother and a Black father. I myself am someone who identifies as biracial with a white mother and a black father. And so that type of representation it was valuable to me. I think it's valuable generally when we feel like we can connect on that sort of personal level with characters that we see, characters that look like us, characters that come from the same place that we do, or maybe have the same life circumstances. And so there was something in that I really, really valued. And I think in addition to that, the fact that we see Cassie and Dean sort of in this intimate space was also extremely valuable and meant a lot to me. And I remember texting my mom and I was like, yo, like Dean had a black girlfriend. And it was so important to me. And it was something that in the context of this show about these two white dudes from Kansas in their 67 Impala traversing the United States, like this is not something that I thought I would see in Supernatural. And so it was surprising to me on so many levels. And I think, again, not only the fact that they introduced a woman of color that was a love interest for Dean, they didn't fetishize her, they didn't objectify her. Like, she was a well-rounded character. And I think in addition to that, they sort of introduced these themes of America's sort of dark history with racism and violence against people of color. And the fact that they introduced these themes and had these characters sort of in the midst of all of this and never questioning, like, is the truck racist? Like, there was none of that. There was never a question from Sam and Dean, like, is that what's going on? Like, is it racism or is it something else? And I think that there was something about that was so amazing. There were also some things that were somewhat problematic. I think, I would have liked to have seen more collaboration with Cassie to sort of bring this to a close. I think, some could interpret Sam and Dean as sort of like these white saviors that come in and save the day, So that is somewhat problematic. And also more things that I think maybe could have done better, which I'll get to a little bit later. But episode 13, Route 666, so powerful, so valuable, something that I very much appreciated. The last message that I want to talk a little bit about that I feel like I gleaned from season 1 is related to the idea of stigma. And so in the mental health community, and in many communities actually, but specifically thinking about mental health, when we talk about stigma, in the very simplest terms, stigma is related to sort of like a set of negative or unfair beliefs that we ascribe to people who have some sort of mental health concern. So if somebody identifies as depressed, if somebody identifies as anxious, we automatically make up this sort of negative belief in our mind. If we hear that somebody has a personality disorder, it's like there's a stigma that is attached to that. And the episode that I'm thinking of in particular that I felt like was really indicative of this idea of stigma is actually episode 15 of season 1. It was called The Benders. And Sam and Dean go to this town in rural Minnesota looking for something that has been kidnapping people, something that they believe to be supernatural. Sam gets kidnapped by this thing, and it turns out that it is a family of people who sort of live out in the country that kidnap folks so that they can hunt them. And I remember there's a scene in the episode where Sam realizes and he says out loud, they're just people. And to me, this is interesting for two reasons. One, as a horror fan, I feel like people are usually the scariest ones out of everything, right? Like, you see a vampire, like, of course I'm scared of that. Like, I'm scared of that. Like, no one's supposed to have teeth like that. No one, whatever. You see Jason Voorhees, he's like 9 foot tall, like whatever. You are scared because that's what you think. You know what I'm saying? Whereas people, to me, are scarier because you can be sitting next to Norman Bates or Patrick Bateman or whoever, and you have no idea what is happening like underneath all of that. And so it's interesting to me that it seems like for Sam and Dean, that is almost reversed. Like they are used to vampires and werewolves and ghosts and demons and all these things. So people coming out of pocket and being the ones that are caused, up to the shenanigans and causing all of the grief is almost, it seems somewhat foreign to them. And I just thought that that was very interesting. So I feel like this is an amazing lesson in perspective taking, in understanding how one's experiences, one's worldview really influences how they interpret and make meaning of the things around them. So for example, if I was driving through a rural town in Minnesota or in anywhere in the United States, I would absolutely 10,000% be afraid of the people, because that has been my experience, right? Like it is something that I'm working on, but like I have been socialized as, a person of color, as a woman, that you don't stop in certain places that there aren't a lot of people around, or you don't stop in certain places where you don't see anybody who looks like you. And so I have been, because of my experiences, because of my worldview, whether for good or for ill, sort of socialized in this way. Whereas we see for Sam and Dean, it is shocking to them that people are the one that are engaged in the shenanigans. You know what I'm saying? It is shocking to them that people are hurting other people. And again, that's just so interesting to me, because for them, the norm is that if there is pain, harm, whatever that's happening, the cause of that, the aggressor, the perpetrator, is something that is supernatural. Whereas for me, that has not been my experience that I know of, knock on wood, that anything that I have experienced has been caused by something supernatural, knock on wood. Let's hope that that does not happen. Unless that means Sam and Dean will come to my house. So maybe let's hope that that does happen. But that's neither here nor there. So for me, this is a lesson not only, again, in perspective taking and worldview, but also in, again, the beliefs that we may ascribe to someone or something because of the identity that they have, or because of some sort of characteristic about them. So again, in this case, for Sam, he did not ascribe any sort of negative belief to these people until he saw what they were doing. And then he's like, oh my gosh, whatever, But any monster anywhere, we ascribe this sort of like they must be up to no good because of, how they look or whatever, what have you. And so again, I think they explore that much more later on in this series in terms of, especially when we start bringing in angels and demons and the beliefs that we may have about how they should behave. They don't always act in accordance with those beliefs. So more to come on that later. But absolutely an amazing message that I think was delivered very subtly. And so with that, in sort of bringing this supernatural spotlight to a close, I'm going to remix the compliment sandwich that I usually do. Forgive me, Stewie Griffin. I'm going to remix it a little bit. And I'm going to talk about my favorite episode, my least favorite, and then also some just sort of overall notes about the season. And so starting with my favorite episode, that would actually be episode 6 of season 1, titled Skin. And in this episode, we see Sam and Dean go to St. Louis, I believe it was, because Sam receives word that one of his college friends was accused of murder. And so they go and try to help out and try to figure out what's going on. And so in this episode, what I appreciate is that both Sam and Dean are dealing with like past versions of themselves. So quite literally, Sam is sort of confronted with, who he used to be as this like college student and with all these friends and sort of like very social. And he's really confronted with how much his life has changed. And I think with Dean, he's indirectly confronted with those things because Dean is, so spoiler alert, it ends up that a shapeshifter is actually the person that is doing all of the murders, and they figure that out. And when they confront the shapeshifter actually takes on the form of Dean. And so we see Sam sort of in a altercation with shapeshifter Dean, which again, that was an amazing fight scene for it to be like season 1 of this show, 2005 on the CW. That was an amazing fight scene. I loved everything about it. But we see shapeshifter Dean sort of go on this whole rant about Dean's feelings towards Sam, about all these different things. And, we're left to sort of think about how much of that is true, how much of that is just the shapeshifter trying to stir the pot and try to start all this drama and up to no good. Nonetheless, I think in this episode, again, we're both Sam and Dean are really confronted with who they used to be, how things have changed, and how they really feel about that. And of course, in true Winchester fashion, they don't talk about it. They just kind of move on and on to the next thing. And I think it was absolutely beautiful. That was my favorite episode of season 1. And one might say because there were 2 Dean Winchesters on the screen at the same time. I will not say that. I will also not say that that's not true. So, favorite episode 6. Least favorite, I actually don't have a least favorite episode. I know a lot of people don't like the episode Bugs, with all the bugs. I didn't think it was bad. Like, a lot of people really hated it. I didn't hate it. I won't say, again, I don't really think I had a least favorite episode. There were some things that I didn't like that I'll sort of point to now. And the first is really just an annoyance that I have with all kind of TV shows. But I feel like there's consistently things that happen that just don't happen in real life. Exhibit A. Why are people walking in alleys alone at night, and why is it always foggy? Like, there's no fog anywhere else but this empty alley that you're walking in by yourself with your headphones in. There's all kind of fog. Like, what? There's an instance in season 1 where Sam gets in to see a psychiatrist at the last minute. This is America. That does not happen. Not in a psychiatrist's office, not anywhere. You're not getting nowhere last minute. Even if you go to the urgent care, you have to wait. Not a thing that happens. I also feel like they just way too easily have all these fake credit cards. Like, I know credit card fraud is not rocket science, but I feel like it's also not that easy. Last thing I'll say. Two more things I'll say. One, I don't remember which episode this was. I think it was like 4 or 5, but they did a whole exorcism in the back of a plane and nobody heard anything. Every time I watch that episode, I'm like, nobody heard this whole fight, this whole exorcism that was going down. This demon was speaking this weird, scary voice and nobody heard it. Okay, cool. And the last thing I'll say that really just grinds my gears, Sam and Dean get thrown all over everywhere and nobody is ever concussed. Nobody ever has, like, what is happening? Again, I think later on in the series, we figure out why that is. We figure out why Dean eats all this crap food and doesn't have like a heart attack. We figure out why, but in this moment, where we are in the story right now, why is no one ever concussed? They always get thrown up against the wall, whatever. On a more serious note, again, I sort of referenced what I appreciated about episode 13, Route 666, and the way that they really explicitly confronted issues of inequity. I'm here for it. I also wish that there was more diversity, specifically representation of people of color in the show without it sort of being central to the story. So can we just have people of color present because they're just present? And so in that episode, in episode 13, it was absolutely central to the story. So we had people of color. I think we also meet Loretta Devine's character, who Loretta Devine is a goddess. She is amazing. I love everything that she's in, and I want to be best friends with her. But we meet her character, Missouri Mosley, the psychic character. And again, she is a woman of color. She is represented as sort of a character that is critical to the story. And I will say that there were a lot of mannerisms for her that were very stereotypical for Black women, and in the way that Black women are portrayed, that I loved, because I love Loretta Devine, and I wonder if that character looked different. If she would be given the same dialogue, she would have the same, you know what I'm saying? And so, again, nothing, I do feel like they do better as the story goes on, or as the series goes on, with regards to representation and diversity. So, again, I think it gets better. I also think it can't be ignored that in this first season, when we do see characters of color, it's because, again, either they're in like Missouri Mosley, sort of in this very stereotypical role, or they're central to the story, and then there's kind of like nowhere else. We don't just kind of see people just walking around or, what have you. So there's that. So overall, my overall notes from season 1 of Supernatural in this first rewatch, again, I cannot underscore this enough. All of the urban legends, the inclusion of these classic horror elements, chef's kiss. Absolutely amazing. And again, I think part of the reason that I fell in love with the series initially, it was comforting because I'm like, oh, it's like the scary stuff that I like. Yes. So A++. I will also say that from the very beginning, Sam and Dean's ways of interacting, their chemistry, obviously they're fine, just so nice to look at. Aside from that, in addition to that, the way that they work together, like you felt anybody who has a sibling understands what that's like, right? Like their chemistry, their on-screen chemistry as brothers, the way that they interacted, the way that they got on each other's nerves, but then would, fight to the death to protect the other one. Like there's something so familiar about that. There's something that they just play so well. And I think, again, that is part of why I fell in love with the series. Again, I love looking at them. I also love watching them act and watching them, again, their on-screen chemistry. So amazing. And sort of the last thing that I'll say, again, that I feel like as a psychologist and someone who just always is listening with my therapist ears, I think the entirety of this series, really, but it's definitely, we see it explicitly on display in season 1. They all, and when I say all, I mean John, Sam, and Dean, are all distracting themselves from the pain that they don't want to feel about the loss of Mary, about basically the way their life circumstance. Like I think that they're all sort of distracting themselves from that in their own way. And so Sam goes to college. He's like, I'm not even thinking about y'all. Like, whatever. Bye. Whereas we see John and Dean they're hunters, and they're always like, on to the next thing. Like, we hunted this monster, on to the next one, on to the next one. There's no time to really stop and allow themselves to feel. And the reason that I can appreciate that is, excuse my language, because that is some real shit. Distracting yourself from unwanted emotions, that's what coping is. I think that there are just ways that people deem that are healthy distractions, and then there are those that are unhealthy. And I'm not here to judge. I'm not here to tell somebody how you should cope, how you shouldn't cope. I think the entirety of how we see Sam, Dean, and John situated in this first season is a distraction from pain that has built up over time, a distraction from pain that is happening in the moment. And what I think is so interesting about that is, in talking with folks throughout the fandom, Supernatural has become a comfort, a distraction for a lot of people, a lot of fans. Again, it is still one of the top 15 most streamed shows in the United States, and it's not on anymore. You know what I'm saying? People just go back over and over and over through the series because there's something that is comforting about that. There's something that serves as a tool of distraction for us, and that distraction doesn't always have to be from something terrible. It can just be, maybe I just want to be distracted for whatever. It doesn't always have to be from something terrible. But I will say, I think that is so interesting and so beautiful because we see that played out on screen this first season And for a lot of folks engaging with this show, there's this parallel process that is happening as well. Like, I know for me, I look forward to my time rewatching Supernatural because of how it makes me feel. That doesn't mean that other things in my life don't make me feel that way. That means that in this moment, this is a special, unique, intentional experience that I'm having, that I'm seeking out because I want to distract myself from whatever else. And again, that's not bad. Distraction is not bad. It's not good, bad, or otherwise. It is what it is. And so that, again, is something that I can appreciate about this series generally, but especially about how we see it in season 1. So if you are someone who finds Supernatural to be comforting, if you are someone who finds it to be a distraction from other shenanigans in your life, hit me up. I want to hear your story. I'm on all forms of social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Dr. Vanessa Hintz. I'm not on the TikTok yet because I don't understand it and I need somebody to help me figure it out. So if you're that type of person that can help me figure it out, hit me up too, because I want to be down with the kids and be on the TikTok, okay? In all seriousness, thank you all so much for spending this time with me today. I wish you and your families safety, joy, and health. And until next time, beautiful people, carry on.